been undertaking. And I'm also delighted to welcome a number of speakers who are going to be forming a panel after their presentation. And I'd really particularly like to welcome Isabel Bremner. I'll introduce all the panelists a little bit more when they come and sit down later. Rebecca Smith, welcome Rebecca from Save the Children. Avril Maddock from the University of West of England. And Ruth Evans from the University of Southampton. And as I say, I'll say a little bit about our panellists after Ruth and her team have presented her findings. So she's going to talk to the title of Caringscapes, Responses to Death and Family Relations in Urban Senegal.
Okay, thank you, Sally. Yeah, it's great to be able to share the findings of our research with you today. We've just written the first draft, really, of our report, which the discussants have seen. And this is a kind of summary, really, of some of the key findings. Obviously, it's quite brief, and we can't go into too much detail. But we just wanted to give you a kind of taster of the key findings of the research. So it's funded by the Leverhulme Trust, and we've been looking at really the emotional and material significance of an adult relative's death in a diverse sample of families of varying socioeconomic status from the three largest ethnic groups in Senegal in 2 cities. And we've had a specific focus on intergenerational dynamics and sought to interview 2 members of each family, where possible, of different generations, and with a particular focus on children and young people as well. So we've done 59 interviews with family members from 30 families, so that includes 9 children, 12 to 17, and 19 young people, 18 to 30. And we also wanted to explore religious differences. So although the majority of families are Muslim, we also recruited 12 Roman Catholic families. We conducted key informant interviews as well with local and religious leaders in the 4 localities we're working in, and with professionals, NGO and government professionals working at local level as well as nationally. We also did focus groups, 1 in each locality, with groups of women or young people who are generally members of associations. And for each family, we also first did a family profile and took observations of the family living sort of circumstances as well. So we're planning to present the preliminary report and discuss it further with participants and with more strategic kind of professionals in Senegal in November. And then the final report, which we hope the discussions will feed into, will be published in January. So just briefly to talk about the kind of theoretical framings behind the project, really. We're adopting an ethic of care perspective, which really emphasises relationality and fundamental human issues of interdependence, vulnerability, and the potential for suffering that Jane often talked about this morning. We're also drawing on some of the literature about the embodied nature of caring relations and practices and the ways that they vary in different spatial and temporal contexts. And part of this underpins the kind of methodological approach as well, the ethical approach, in terms of trying to understand feminist understandings of the relationship between the researcher and researched, reflecting on reflexivity and the emotionality of the research process. So one of the key kind of concepts we're drawing on, particularly in this paper, is the idea of caringscapes and carescapes that Sophie and colleagues have developed. So carescapes really refers to the sort of resources for care and the spatial and temporal accessibility, so kind of perhaps the more formal support systems that may be in place. And caringscapes is more about the informal caring practices and the ways that those are socially patterned through time and space. So they comprise multiple temporalities, thinking about different individuals' life course, as well as daily routines of caring, institutions as well, and the spatialities, how people negotiate those in different locales. And it's also drawing attention to socio-cultural norms of care and obligation reciprocity, as well as the emotional dynamics and feelings, subjective positions associated with care, within a broader kind of analysis of the unequal power relations and how care is often devalued, and practices are shaped by the distribution of resources. Another key kind of framing really is the literature on children, youth and families in sub-Saharan Africa. Children are often seen as integral to extended families and communities, and African concepts of childhood and youth often emphasise the reciprocal rights and responsibilities that children have to their families and communities. So, for example, the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child includes, for example, children's responsibility to preserve and respect the family. So childhood is often framed then by this implicit intergenerational contract between generations, so that younger family members are expected to care for older or sick family members, and often within the context of very limited welfare support. And although the changes may be occurring in response to different pressures in African countries, such as rural to urban migration or the HIV epidemic, or more recently perhaps Ebola in West Africa, generational hierarchies and intergenerational care and relations, respect for elders, seem to be enduring kind of features of African societies. So in common with many African countries, the population of Senegal is very youthful, half of the population aged under 18. Many households are characterised by kind of multiple diverse livelihood strategies, which are often in different places, and there's a very wide range of diverse and fluid kind of household composition. So the household can be defined as members of kin who don't necessarily reside in it, but who contribute economically and socially to it, as well as non-kin members who may stay for temporary or longer periods, or who may eat with the family, for example. And the majority of households in Senegal have an extended family structure, so there's an average of 7 people in households in urban areas, which is relatively high compared to some other African countries. In terms of framings of death and bereavement studies, so Avril has argued that bereavement, like religion, is often compartmentalised in designated spaces and times, but it is, of course, an everyday feature of life, and our focus has been on kind of ordinary, everyday experiences of death. Much of the work on death and bereavement studies to date has been rooted, though, in kind of medicalised and individualised frameworks developed largely in the global north. And there's not much work really looking at the material, social and emotional responses in Africa. Recent sociological work has drawn on the notion of continuing bonds between the living and the dead, and shown that these are shaped by relationships in life, the nature of death, and other social factors. And in this project we've used the term responses to death, following Klass's argument, rather than the term bereavement, as a way to move away from the dominant discourse of, the individualised journey of grieving. So in Africa, there hasn't been much attention on the kind of material and emotional dimensions of death, but there has been some work on, particularly on outcomes of parental death on orphan children, often in the context of HIV. There's also been recent work, policy interest really, in developing cash transfers for vulnerable groups and the development of social protection systems more generally. So this is kind of a bit of the background sort of policy context for our study. So if we just briefly talk about the context in Senegal. So almost half of the population live in urban areas, and about over 3 million people, or half of all people living in urban areas, live in Dakar, the capital city on the coast. We're also doing research in Kaolack, another city which is much smaller, which is in the main groundnut growing kind of area of Senegal. And Senegal is sort of comprised really by this complex social milieu. You've got this triple heritage of African, Islamic and French colonial kind of influences. And it's a very different setting from where I've worked previously in East Africa, which has a British colonial heritage. So the majority of the population are Muslim. There's a small percentage of people are Christian, largely Roman Catholic. The majority of the population are also married in monogamous unions, but there's quite high numbers of polygamous unions as well. So in urban areas it's about 29%. The life expectancy in urban areas is higher than in rural areas, about 67 years. And the mortality rate is about 6% in urban areas, although these figures need to be treated with caution because there's very low levels of registrations of death in Senegal. So we chose 4 localities which had kind of ethnically diverse populations of urban residents, most of whom worked in the informal sector. So we had, in each city we had one central kind of neighbourhood and one more peripheral one. And the peripheral ones stood out really as being perhaps characterised by more poverty and more kind of economic and geographical marginality. There's poor basic infrastructure and sanitation, susceptibility to flooding every year in the rainy season, and limited formal welfare support or services. And the more central neighbourhoods had a more mixed kind of socio-economic profile. The households where we've done research are generally quite large, have a very fluid composition, which is difficult. You get different accounts from different people in the family, and when doing a family profile of how many people actually live there. So as you can see the numbers there, so the majority, 20, had 6 to 20 people living in the household. And family, including the neighbours, so family sort of seen in the broadest sense, and the associated moral values were really crucial to survival and to life chances. So I'm just going to start the introduction of the findings, and then Jane and Sophie will continue. So we wanted to explore different aspects of Caringscapes. So in terms of time-space practices of care for sick, elderly and dying relatives, in the sample that we recruited, there were diverse kin and in-law relationships with the deceased. So the largest numbers were women who'd lost a husband, sons or daughters who'd lost a mother, and sons or daughters who'd lost a father. And so practical and financial responsibilities to care for relatives reflected dominant gender and generational norms. So men were often seen as being more responsible for providing financial support, although many women often also contributed to healthcare costs, for example. And young women were often had significant responsibilities for domestic work and often the intimate sort of personal care work, which could impact on their education. The costs of medical treatment also were, very high and could tip families into poverty. Most of the families didn't benefit from any reductions in healthcare costs, as, for example, public sector workers. They would have had a reduction, but as I say, most of them worked in the informal sector. There was also difficult communication about relatives' diagnosis or about the death with some healthcare professionals, and some women talked about gender discriminatory attitudes, that some professionals would only talk to male relatives, for example. In terms of the older people who had died, family members reported that some of them often had a sense that they were going to die and were kind of prepared for death. So one woman talked about that her grandmother had this death sickness, this idea that she knew she was going to die. But younger relatives who died, their death was obviously, perhaps understandably, met with more shock and kind of fear, particularly when people were killed in an assault or an accident. That was much more difficult to sort of come to terms with. In terms of kind of care of the dead, after after the person had died, religion was really key to this in terms of the practices that surrounded caring for the dead. The preparation of the body, the burial, the funeral varied according to religion, whether people were Muslim or Roman Catholic, and that governed the timing of the burial, the timing of the funeral, but it also was determined by the level of poverty or wealth that people had. So some people might have wanted, if they were Muslim, to have a ceremony on the day of burial, on the 3rd, on the 8th day, and on the 40th day after the death, but they couldn't afford it. So they talked about that. So among Muslims, there seemed to be a very strong fear of the dead body, and the segregation of women and children, who are sort of young children, from seeing the body. There's a sense that it should be hidden from them. They shouldn't see that, and going to cemeteries as well. And there were less marked kind of differences among Catholics. Women, children and men attended burials and funerals, and women regularly visited cemeteries. Some burial sites were significant for some, while others had never visited the grave and didn't want to, so it was quite a varied sort of response. Some were buried in particular places because of religious sort of affiliation to particular brotherhoods. In terms of mourning practices for widowed, they were very much determined by temporal aspects as well as spatial aspects. So women often separated from everyday behaviours. They wore special clothing, bathing, engaged in prayers, and that varied, the time period varied according to religion. So for Muslim women it was 4 months, 10 days. For Catholic women it was 6 months to a year. But there was some recognition that women could work if they needed to during this period. And then in terms of sort of care after death, the response from other family members and neighbours, this was, co-presence was seen as really important. So people coming to the house after the death and showing their solidarity. They gave, usually contributed condolence money, which usually met the costs of the funeral. And it was seen as very important that family members whose relative had died were not left alone in that immediate aftermath after the death. And prayers were an important way as well that family members felt connected to the deceased. There's this sense that they were praying for the person who died, but that person who died was also praying for them, so this idea of sort of mutual care. And people made offerings as well in remembrance of the person who died. So they prepared dishes enjoyed by the deceased and gave them to their children or to older people in the community, other relatives, or to the talibé, the kind of children who are sort of disciples in the Quranic schools, as alms, as a way to remember them. They didn't necessarily tell them that they were doing it in remembrance of someone, but they just felt that they wanted to do that. And people also held religious ceremonies, for example on anniversaries, particularly the first anniversary after the death, where they organised a Quran recital or organised a mass. And people talked about how much they thought about the deceased and felt their absence, particularly in the home, but also doing particular activities, studying, going to market together, etc., or clothing or photos particularly reminded them of their relative. Okay, I'll hand over to Jane.
Right, well, at this point, you'll see the heading moves on to emotions, and immediately that raises the issue of, how are emotions expressed and how far are they separable? I'd like to say that both Sophie and I were new to working in Africa, and so there were times at which our transcripts and our interviews really struck us quite forcibly. And one of those ways was that people very often expressed things quite briefly and didn't elaborate their emotions. but one of the other issues also is how does one understand emotions in a context where survival is so harsh, and how far is it a particular notion from the global north that you can separate out emotions from the material. I've got a quote there from Nancy Shepherd-Hughes: emotions cannot be understood outside of the cultures that produce them. But also a quote from one of our Senegalese interviews: you know the Senegalese are afraid of death. So you need to keep that context in mind. One of the other things that didn't work in quite the way we'd expected, we thought it would be nice to start the interviews with something like a life history approach, with the idea that people are talking about things they know about and we can understand the context in which they've lost their relative. The life history accounts were absolutely minimal. We didn't get anything like the sort of life history account you might get if you were doing it in the UK. But what we did get is, quite commonly, quite an elaborated story about the death itself. So people would start talking and presenting what you might call a narrative. And in that narrative, again, one of the things that we found very striking was the way in which people did not necessarily, or not at all, expect to present an explanation of the death in the way that we would normally expect to hear it amongst people that we know in this country. So what counts, we put explanation in inverted commas there, because what counts as an explanation, but particularly what was noticeable was that the accounts and the explanations were not medicalised. And you'll see in the table at the bottom there that 24 people used a term, but that's not to say they gave a medical explanation of the death. They might just simply use that term in a kind of descriptive way. What was very prevalent was that we might get a description of the symptoms that the person had experienced. So it might be something like they had aches, or they were tired, or they had a problem with their stomach. But equally, the religious explanations were quite pervasive, more commonly amongst the middle and older generations. And in those terms, it was a question of saying that it's God's will. And you'll see, though, that the religious framing is very powerful and carries on being important in our analysis. So, I've mentioned about this brevity of people's responses. So there's an issue straight away about how do we understand that. There were certain words that people used again and again. And there was some discussion in the session I was in this morning about scripts. And some of this felt very much like scripts. But it felt also like they were scripts that you were meant to be able to understand. Perhaps the point was that you didn't have to have it elaborated, you were meant to understand. So this term about it being hard came up over and over again. People talked about feeling alone. The language of a void or an emptiness came up a lot. And there are some issues here about translation. The French would be un vide. People talked quite a lot about needing advice. And this term tired came up quite a lot. So I've given you a couple of quotes there about how people express some of those feelings. What wasn't very apparent is a sense of having lost a specific relationship with a specific individual. So there was quite a strong account of what it was that people did think they'd lost. And one of the key issues there was the loss of a particular role, that it was really hard to lose a mother, a father, an older sibling, an aunt, whoever it was, that it was described in those terms, that you've lost the person who fulfills that role. People also talked about losing shared activities, friendship, companionship, especially if it was a marriage. I think out of all of the interviews, there were 3 people who said something about the particular personality of the person who'd died. And in those cases, it was generally about them being particularly sociable and outgoing, and what a difference it made that they weren't there in the house anymore. But very, very importantly, the loss of support. And I think this quote that I've given you here, I will read out because I think it's really important. When he received money, he gave us all the money, and I managed the house. I often think of him. I cry each time I have problems. I think of my eldest daughter's schooling and the rent. I'm responsible for all that, and I can't afford it. So I think that's very powerfully conveying how the material and the emotional is so bound up together. And it's there's some work that I've come across in the past by Demmer where he kind of discusses the possibility that grief as an emotion is a luxury, that you can only experience grief fully if you're in good circumstances. But I wonder actually whether that sets it up as too much of a dichotomy, and actually the grief and the emotion is just really bound up together. People also did talk about embodied manifestations of their responses. So quite a few people talked about sleeping problems, becoming very tired, becoming thin or sick. And they talked quite easily about thinking about the deceased. So they were quite prepared to say, yes, they thought about the deceased a lot. What they weren't prepared to do, or felt that they shouldn't be doing, is expressing a lot of sorrow and distress, which is the point of this slide. There was a very strong sense that people were meant to manage their emotions, and that actually crying had to be really strictly limited. And this was true for both themselves and for others. You've got a couple of quotes there, one from a father talking about his children, and one from a son talking about a teenage son, talking about how there's no sense in keeping on crying. So religious beliefs played a really important part in all of this, and it was clear that religious beliefs could really help people to accept the death, and that was a primary requirement that religion laid upon them, really, because the death was God's will. This has happened. So I think maybe we're familiar with the idea that people cry, why has this happened? Here, you would not ask why has it happened. The point is that it has happened and you accept it because it's God's will. And I really like this quote here from Saya, because I think it encapsulates quite a lot of this. I thank the good Lord because it was him that gave me my mother. Now that he needs her, there's nothing I can do. So I think that encapsulates quite a lot of the different issues at stake here. But equally, religious ideas were a really important part of the regulation of emotions, and it struck me very powerfully what a powerful way that is of regulating emotions, because if you can't control them, it calls your faith into doubt. So this is a quote here from one of our local informants. You shouldn't exaggerate because everything has a limit. Religion doesn't tolerate a person crying for so long during the funeral period. Of course, religion allows us to cry, but if you persist, it's like calling into question divine will. So there was a very strong obligation that you should stop crying, certainly after the first few days or weeks, and carry on surviving and living. So that I think throws up a lot of food for thought about how the emotions are being managed.
One of the things that Jane said starting this morning was about change and about whether change was troubling or not. And of course, one of the things that followed on very much from the death were family changes, and not surprisingly, sometimes impact on household finances. But that had many knock-on effects, most particularly often on children who might have to work in the holidays or might indeed give up school in order to work to support the family. And there was also issues of inheritance. But when we talk about inheritance, the thing that's really striking is there was very little to inherit. I mean, when you talked about what had been inherited, it was mostly clothing, occasionally a few objects. It says here, only 4 people inherited something substantial like a house. So that was done according to religion, but it tended to have relatively little material impact for most of the people that we interviewed. So the reconfiguration of familial roles and of generational hierarchies reproduced the kinds of things that were there before, Particularly significant were changes in the sort of head of the household and the Khalifa, that is the person in the household who had the kind of moral authority, might not be in charge of day-to-day things, but had the moral authority. And for some people, say a widow might say, well, now I have to be mother, father and Khalifa. I have to do everything. And it also set up new caring routines and responsibilities for young people. And here, the gendered relationships that Ruth already alluded to were very significant. That it was girls, by and large, who had to take on new household tasks and caring tasks. Boys were more likely to have to take on work, paid work, but that also occurred for young women as well. One of the things that was very striking was the continued significance of sibling relationships. It was extremely important to people at all stages of the life course. And again, the hierarchy of my elder brother or my elder sister or my younger brother, those age hierarchies remain very important. And along with the many consequences in responding to the death and potentially the loss of income or the loss of a protector and a money earner, might be migration and residential mobility. And people went to live with other family members, and sometimes some distance away, or they returned, some women returned to their own families, as it were, as against their husbands' families. One of the things that certainly occurred was sometimes the separation of young children as part of this, from parents being sent away to in foster relationships to other members of the household. So caring routines and family practices continued in much the same way as before the death, as I've already said. But the thing that was a leitmotif, I think, throughout the interviews actually was this central importance of the family, and particularly for young people. When we talked about, what was important, I think I will read this quote. What's most important for my future is to continue my studies, to succeed, because I really want to help my mother, or I really want to help my family. This was such a common statement, and it was sort of taken for granted that what you were going to do was something that would contribute to the family, or parents talking about their children's future, that what was important was that their children should succeed, whatever that meant, and be able to contribute to the family. And finally, it led to a change in the imagined futures for young people. Some became more religious, more aware of mortality, and desirous of behaving morally in the future.
We're running out of time, rapidly. Just briefly, in terms of the Caringscapes, so the formal kind of resources for care, only a tiny minority of participants reported receiving any formal support from government, NGOs, schools or employers, and most were not aware of any support services in their locality. Government and NGO professionals expressed frustration with the very limited resources they had for social protection for vulnerable children and families in need. They also pointed to the lack of coordination and lack of shared understanding about who was deemed to be most the target groups, most deserving of support. There was also a sense of Senegalese Wolof values, which might include a reticence to speak of family problems to others and a respect for authority figures, which could hinder communication and prevent people from seeking available support. So informal support from relatives, neighbours, friends was really crucial. I mentioned the condolence money before. Also, people provided ongoing kind of emotional and moral support, sometimes ongoing material support and practical assistance. And also some informal support was available from local associations of youth or women's groups or particular ethnic minority groups in their neighbourhood. But family members perceive their needs primarily in terms of their material needs, so children's educational costs, food, employment, housing, but as well the young people particularly mentioned advice and moral and emotional support. So just to conclude then, I think hopefully we've shown that the importance of time-space dimensions of care and embodiment in understanding these caringscapes after death within this context of very limited formal resources to support families and communities. I think Jane talked particularly about this, how the material and emotional significance of death are interwoven, and that has implications for how we theorise care and responses to death cross-culturally. So the crucial importance of the family, the solidarity and informal support networks is, crucial in urban neighbourhoods. Religion was really important as well as a source of comfort and helping people to accept the death, but it could also be a source of tension in terms of containing tears and more extreme kind of responses to the death. The significance of the living feeling connected to the death through prayers and offerings for the dead and by the dead for the living seems important. It can be seen as an expression of continuing bonds and reciprocal care after death. But the gap really between family members' experiences and the policy rhetoric about social protection really calls into question to what extent the limited available resources are actually reaching the intended beneficiaries and highlights the inadequacies of current kind of care resources. So I think it points really to the need for an ethic of care which really recognises the complex interdependence of communitarian relational selves, religion and material emotional responses to death in urban Africa as well as in cross-cultural contexts. Notions of family and community and caring responsibilities are based on a much more communitarian sense of relatedness and relational selves. Aspirations for the future really are very much entwined with thinking about your responsibilities to other family members, and perhaps it's a lot more communitarian than what we're used to in the global north. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure you'd like to join me to thank Ruth, Jane and Sophie for a very interesting presentation of their findings.
Fula rokata nafani, fula lata kabarani bojulungisa.